Welcome on to the next edition of the Faster Beyond 50 podcast. My name is Brad Nadalt. We've got the coach Lindsay Parry with us once again, and it is another listener Q&A episode. We've got some great questions around cortisol. We've got a question about losing weight. We've just some feeling flat after runs. So a lot to unpack in today's episode. Lindsay, nice to catch up. Are you well?
I'm very good, Brad. I've caught a sneak peek of the questions, obviously, and I think every now and then you just like to nudge me out of my comfort zone. So, some good questions to stretch my brain this time around.
I do like that. And don't forget, if you have a question you'd like answered, if you're part of the Coach Parry community, it's as easy as popping into the forum on the app, asking the question. Now, a team of coaches are there to assist you right away. If you'd like it answered here on the podcast, all you need to do is click on the link that is in the podcast player that you're listening to. Or if you're watching this video on YouTube, you can click on the link in the description and you can ask your question there. Just so you do know, we filter the video questions to the top of the queue. We just love hearing and seeing you on these videos. We also then use the voice note ones as well. And then if there are any written questions that pop out, we will use those too. But we do filter the video ones to the top. Lindsay, let's jump straight into today's questions. And the first one comes through from Jackie.
I do have a question. Just getting in from my long run today, just 10 miles. I'm struggling, and I can do 10 miles on a treadmill with no problem. I do live in Texas. It's quite humid. I think it was about 85% and 80 degrees this morning. But towards the end of my run, I would stop to walk and my blood pressure would just drop. So I ate, I hydrated, I had some gels. Any suggestions? I am open to taking. Thank you.
Lindsay, before you answer that question, I need to call Jackie out here because this is a very South African thing that Jackie just did then. Just to give some context, here in South Africa, we've got an ultra marathon called the Comrades Marathon, which is 56 miles. And so many people start running. They don't start running because they want to run 5Ks or 10Ks. They start running because they want to run this crazy ultra marathon. And I'm being one of them. So I speak from experience. And so often we talk to South Africans and they go, I just ran a half marathon or I just ran a marathon. There's no such thing as a just 10 miler. Jackie, you ran 10 miles in your long run. 10 miles is a long way. So that's the first thing. Lindsay, let's help Jackie. Obviously living in Texas, very hot, very humid. What advice have you got for her?
Yeah, so that's probably the biggest reason for how difficult the long run was, is that heat and humidity. But there's also lots of other little tricks that we can use, and there are other factors at play. So if you're doing most of your training on a treadmill, then we also just have to acknowledge that running on a treadmill is easier than running on the road. Okay, so you don't have the variation in terrain, for example, and you've got a rolling resistance rather than the same level of resistance that you have when you're running out on the road. So it's very definitely a bit easier on the treadmill. It's not to say that the treadmill is no good. I mean, it's very good. But we must be aware of those small nuances. And so to compensate for that, just make sure that you aren't always running with your treadmill on 0%, because that's effectively a little bit like running on a slight downhill all the time when you run outside. So just to give you an idea of the comparison. Of course, on the treadmill, you can also really control that ambient temperature. And so you don't have the environmental stresses when you run outside. And so now what does that mean when you do transition to outside? So in this particular case, we have to compensate for the heat and humidity. So your body will be compromised by its inability to shift heat. And so when we run in a hot, humid environment, we should be running a lot slower than we would when we're running on the treadmill. So that's the first adjustment that you need to make. That can be anywhere between 5 and 20 seconds, to be honest. Quite a per kilometer per mile. It can be a really big difference depending on how hot and how humid it is. Using your heart rate isn't a bad tool to get that relative intensity right. So the heat will probably spike your heart rate by about 10 to 15, and the cardiac drift that happens. So if we're exercising on the treadmill or outside for any length of time, there will be a slow and steady increase in your heart rate, even though the intensity or how hard the exercise feels doesn't increase. Okay, now that decoupling, when it's very hot and humid, that'll happen even sooner. And so that'll be a good clue to you that your body's not actually coping with the heat. And it means that your body, to try and cope with the heat, is needing more energy. So there also needs to be a compensation for providing more energy than normal. So you took some gels, but you perhaps could have taken a little bit more in this instance. Okay. But if we ignore that decoupling, what is going to happen is that eventually your heart rate is going to be quite a lot higher than what is required for that level of exercise. And so what happens then is towards the end of your exercise, you've got quite a high heart rate. You stop running and walk. And as soon as you do that, your body temperature will start to react immediately. And then what will happen is your heart rate will fall quite quickly. And if your heart rate falls too quickly, we get what's called a vasovagal response. Now, what causes that is that when we exercise, there's two mechanisms for your body to get more blood moving to different parts of the body faster. Okay, the one is increase the heart rate. The other is open the vessels. Okay, so our blood vessels are able to constrict and vasodilate. So they can vasoconstrict, vasodilate. So now when you start to get this decoupling and your heart rate starts to get much higher than it should be for that level of exercise, we open a highway. Okay. So it's like you're in Vancouver when you're driving onto Vancouver Island for work and you've got whatever 20 lanes in front of you and you look up and you can see all the green arrows because they've opened the highway for everyone coming into town. And I'm sure it's not Vancouver's not the only place in the world this happens. It's just the one that I thought of. But for people leaving the island to go out into the suburbs, there's only 2 lanes open because we don't need it. So that's literally what's happening with your blood vessels. They are opening and closing. But the dilation and constriction happens slower than the changing of the heart rate. So now you've got these huge open blood vessels. Heart rate comes down quickly. That's where the dizziness is coming from. Potentially also from a lack of energy. But I don't think that's really the case here. I think you are getting a little bit of vasovagal response is what its name is. But essentially your blood pressure is just dropping really quickly because the heart rates come down and the blood vessels are wide open. So how do we compensate for this cardiac drift? Well, we drift. Well, we adjust for the intensity. So when you go outside in the hot and humidity, you run a little bit slower and you just do more frequent walk breaks, even if you shorten them. So to compensate. So let's say you're walking a minute every 3 miles, cut that down to every 1 to 2 miles and cut the walk break in half, 30 seconds. So shorter walk breaks more often, just to steady off that intensity, make sure the intensity is a little bit lower, compensate by having a little bit more nutrition. And of course, on the run, you can have some cooling strategies. So you can start by bringing your body temperature down before you leave the house. So have a towel that you've chucked into the fridge or freezer, and you drape that over yourself so that you almost get yourself a little bit cold when you start. That will also just slow down the point to which you get to that, let's call it heat stress or under stress from heat. You can have something wet that you wear around your forehead that maybe there's some points on the route where you can wring that out and put cold water and put it over. There's some garments that you can get that when you sweat into them, they have like a chemical reaction and then the garment itself actually cools down a little bit. You can get yourself like an ice vest, although that's quite heavy, but it still does a really good job of cooling you for the first half of your run. So there are some things that you can put in place to actually physically cool down. If you run with a flask that keeps the water quite cool, if you're drinking cold water through the duration of that run and cooling yourself slightly from the inside. And these are all things that make small differences, but they end up feeling like perhaps making a larger difference. So, yeah, those are your strategies that you can use when moving from training inside to outside, and they're generally good strategies to use if you live in a hot and humid environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Jackie, I hope that does help. Thanks for the great question. Don't forget, if you'd like to submit yours, just click on the link in the podcast player you're listening to this podcast on, or you can click in the description on YouTube as well. Next question, Lindsay, this one from Dennis.
My name's Dennis, coming to you from Pueblo, West Colorado in the United States. And thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. It seems to me, from what I've learned from Faster Beyond 50 and other sources, that low-fat or skim milk would be an excellent choice for an immediate post-workout drink. And I'm wondering what you all thought about that.
Cool. Great question from Dennis. Lindsay. And we did last week, we did a deep dive on recovery. So if you haven't watched that or listened to that podcast yet, please go back into the feed and check that one out, because we do dive deep. But talking about post exercise nutrition, what are your thoughts on Dennis's question?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing there is that we want to utilize the first 30 minutes to an hour, but the first 30 minutes, importantly, immediately after exercise, to replace lost muscle glycogen. And that's especially important for sessions that are an hour and a half or longer and high intensity sessions. Okay, so that's kind of what we are working within. So milk is a good option, but it's not very high in sugar. So it's probably got the right ratio of sugar to protein, but it doesn't have enough. You'd have to drink a lot of milk, and so that's why we use flavored milk. So if it's chocolate or strawberry or whatever, flavored milk, because the powder mix generally has a little bit more sugar in it. So just to give you an idea, you're probably looking at roughly 3 grams of lactose, which is a sugar that occurs in milk. And we probably, per 100 mils, and we probably want to get closer to 7, 8, even 11 grams per 100 mils for that post-exercise drink. So milk is good, and it's miles better than nothing. And I do often tell people who say, I don't have time or I don't have the inclination, but they're perfectly happy to have like 8-ounce cappuccino, for example. And then I'm like, go for it. That's great, because that's a sizable amount of milk. And so it's way better than having nothing. But I would add a little bit more. I'd make it a flavored milk, especially for those 1.5 hour longer and high intensity runs.
Cool. Great question, Dennis. Thank you very much for that one. All right, Lindsay, next question came through as a voice note, and this one was from Marta.
Parry team, you are asking what you can help me with. My name is Marta, and I've been with Coach Parry a few years now. And I think the one thing I've been struggling with recently is nutrition. I'm getting better, but I had gained some weight back, and I know that's impacting my running pace. So I am improving. I'm getting a little faster. So I think what I'd like help on is nutrition and balancing everything out. So that's it. Thank you. We love you guys for all that you do.
If you're over 50 and want to recover from sessions faster, run pain and injury-free, and improve your endurance, then be sure to join Lindsay and I for our upcoming Faster Beyond 50 Masterclass. In it, we'll show you how we helped a 70-year-old run a 47-minute, 18-second 10K, and how you can take those exact same principles and apply them in your training. Simply scan the QR code that's on screen right now, or click on the link in the description below to save your seat in the training now. We look forward to seeing you there. Marta, you are most welcome, and thank you for listening. Advice for Marta, Lindsay?
Yeah, so this is one of those questions that's extremely tough to do justice to on a podcast when you don't have the guest with you, because it really depends on so many things. And nutrition is so complicated in that too much, or let me rephrase that, too little is almost as bad as too much. And the problem with too little is that the problems only manifest themselves a little bit later. But if we're not eating enough, we get ourselves into a very high cortisol state. And when you're in a high cortisol state, then you're in like a fight or flight kind of scenario. And on an evolutionary scale, what that fight or flight generally means is that you're running away from something or in the midst of something that means that you're unlikely to be able to eat and get enough energy. And therefore, your body goes, right, we have to hold on to whatever we got and only let it out slowly. Okay, so that's kind of what's happening on an evolutionary scale if we're not providing enough nutrition for the exercise that we are doing. Okay, so it's quite important to have a good understanding of what you need to take in. And I think that's where something like a calorie tracker app that you can download could be quite useful in this scenario when you're quite confused about what you should be eating, how you should be eating, and when you should be eating it. This is where something like that will come in super handy. A few weeks ago, we had the question around the glucose monitoring there, Brad. So again, this is something where that glucose monitor will really be able to give you a good idea if you're having lots of like blood glucose lows during the day. That'll be a very good idea that you're not fueling yourself well enough for the exercise. So yeah, calorie track will be great because then you can input what you're doing exercise wise. You can input, it'll tell you what you need, and then you can go through a process of elimination, eating different foods and trying different foods, and that will then give you a great idea of, am I eating enough? And in conjunction with the glucose monitor, if you can do something like that, it gives you then a really great idea if you're eating the right things for you. So I think that's probably the best way that I go about that. And then just in terms of general advice, okay, for you, and that is that fuel well during exercise, and that is the period that starts when we're exercising plus the first hour afterwards. So if you're taking care of fueling in there, and maybe taking in a little bit of energy while you're exercising, taking in a reasonable amount of energy or an energy drink or a tea or a coffee or something with a high milk content. If you're vegetarian or vegan, more importantly, different kinds of milks, your macadamia or almond, whatever, those oat milks, those kind of things, but something that's going to provide you with that sugar that you need to replace the muscle glycogen. And then for the rest of the day, make sure that you're eating fairly consistently. Then you're probably okay. And then, as I said, a calorie tracker will then give you a good idea of, is that enough, or are you taking in quite an excess of calories? So yeah, hopefully that'll help you out. But yeah, it's not always, weight gain is not always linked to having too much as some people would like to oversimplify it to that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lindsay, if I can just add in there too as well, and I'm sure Marta is following and she is aware of it too, but we do have another podcast that we produce here at Coach Parry. Two of our colleagues hosted. It is specifically for females over the age of 40. It's called She Runs Strong, and I'll pop the link into the podcast player and the description on YouTube as well. And Shona Hendricks and Nikki Friedman host that podcast, and they chat specifically about females, peri and postmenopausal females, and obviously we get lots of questions around weight gain and losing weight and nutrition on that podcast too. So Marta, if you haven't checked out that podcast yet, please do, and that's also for everybody else who's listening. If you are interested in that, and if you are female over the age of 40, definitely listen and subscribe to that podcast, because there are some golden nuggets on there as well. All right, Lindsay, question from Jen, also a voice note that was submitted on the link that's in the description of this podcast.
Jen from Far Rockaway, New York, a huge fan of Coach Parry. So grateful that you have this podcast option. I have a bazillion questions, but I'm going to start with one that's been sitting in my mind a lot lately. And that is, in terms of running and weight loss, that comes up a lot, is I keep hearing a lot about cortisol and elevated cortisol actually causes people not to lose weight. It causes them to gain weight. And part of the cortisol, I understand, is that the stress hormone comes out. And if it's not properly, I guess, digested or metabolized, then it can cause more weight loss. So how does one who's a runner, who's getting older and hormones over 50 or crazier, make sure that they're not running so much? Well, obviously, if I'm following the plan, but if I am following the plan, I am running, I am hitting, higher stress levels, it's not going to impede on my weight loss because I am hitting that cortisol stress threshold, is what I would think it is. I've been curious about it. I've tried to research about it. I'm not sure if it's just that the internet and TikTok and Instagram is putting the wrong emphasis on the problems of cortisol elevation. And I was wondering if you can give me more information. Of course, I am doing tons of strength training. I've actually upped my strength training. I just want to make sure that I'm not working too hard for nothing.
Lindsay, I love this question. Obviously, Jen's also talking about weight loss, but I mean, cortisol affects multiple aspects of our lives and impacts our running and training and that sort of thing. But let's talk a little bit about cortisol. And first of all, what is it? Sort of what causes it, and how do we manage our cortisol levels?
Yeah, so look, it's a really good question, and it's both simple and difficult to answer at the same time. And I know that makes absolutely no sense, but the simple part of the answer is this, Jen, is that it's easy to look for the clues that will tell you if your cortisol is under control, manageable, etc. So the biggest kind of blinkers for you, or alarms that should be going off if you are consistently in a high cortisol state, is that you will have massive trouble falling asleep and staying asleep if you've got very high cortisol. Now, a lot of people struggle with sleep anyway, so that one people will tell me often isn't as useful as it should be. But if you couple that with like a complete loss of appetite, so if you are really tired all the time, but struggling to sleep and have no appetite, those two things generally are a good idea that you cruising around with high cortisol. So that's kind of, I guess, in some ways the easier way or the easiest way for me to answer that part of the question. The more complicated part of the question comes in to say that the body doesn't differentiate between stress. Okay. So when you've got high stress, family member passing away, going through a divorce, being retrenched. So I'm just trying to think of like very high stress things that happen in adults' lives. But if you've got like this very high period of stress, in that scenario, exercise can be an additional stressor. Being on a diet and restricting calories can be an additional stressor. However, exercise done right shouldn't contribute to cortisol unless you are in overtraining. It should be reducing cortisol. So exercise, particularly moderate to low intensity exercise, is a leacher. It helps to metabolize. That was the right word you used in your question, Jen. So it helps to metabolize cortisol and get it out of your system or keep it manageable. Okay. Also bearing in mind that cortisol in the short term is a good hormone. It allows us to get on with what we need to get on with in high stress situation. Just don't want it there for long sustained periods of time. Okay. So now you've got the tool to monitor roughly what is happening with my cortisol. And now how do we manage it? Well, that is why, it's literally why at Coach Parry, we put such a heavy emphasis on doing easy runs, easy enough. We put that emphasis on it to such a degree that a lot of people mistakenly think that we advocate only easy running. But we have to put that emphasis because it's so important. Because if you're doing your easy runs easy enough, it's going to both make you healthier, help with weight loss, and help you to control cortisol. that's what it's there for. And we are also really big advocates of only doing one high intensity session per week for the majority. It's not appropriate for every runner. We are all at a different level of ability, and we've all got different goals for running. But for the majority of runners, I would go as far as to say 95% of runners do not need to do more than one high intensity session a week. And again, if there's a session that's going to inappropriately cause cortisol to increase, it is that session. And it's why we only do it once a week. And then you have your other 3 to or so runs in a week that are easy enough that you get some progression, that your health improves, and that your cortisol is metabolized and leached out of the system. So that's that gives a pretty good go of answering that question. Lovely question, but it can be quite complicated and technical.
Yeah, absolutely. Jen, thank you so much for reaching out. It was lovely to hear from you. And Lindsay, I'm going to squeeze one more in. Like I said at the start of this podcast, we love video questions. We filter those to the top of the queue. So if you do have a question, please, if you want to ensure that it does get answered on the podcast, pop it through on video. You can click on the link that's in the description of this video and on the player that you're listening to this podcast on. But I'm going to squeeze a written question because I like this question, and I think it's a good one to answer. A few weeks ago we spoke about Strava and comparing ourselves to others, and this almost plays in the same sort of thing, but it's sort of knowing where we're at. And it's from Grant, who's from Toronto in Canada. He's 51 years old. He says, I was a regular walker from 2015 and switched to running in 2022. I did a Couch to 5K program in September, October 22, and completed that run in 43 minutes, 30 seconds. I've improved steadily and finished a PB 5K in 34:50 minutes last week. So he's almost 10 minutes fast on his 5K time, which is amazing. He says, I've struggled to understand what a reasonable rate of improvement should be. How should I set about establishing time targets for the future, say 6 months out, a year out, 2 years out? What can Grant do? And I think this is a cool way to sort of set reasonable goals and reasonable expectations for our training, particularly as we get older. I mean, we don't want to just go, you know what, I'm getting old, so I'm going to give up on any sort of goals. But we don't want to be overstretching and get disappointed when we're actually smacking it out the park, as Grant is.
Yeah, and those are enormous jumps in time, Grant. So well done. I know people who don't really come from running and I guess have therefore a slightly lesser understanding of improvements, wouldn't quite understand that. But honestly, those are phenomenal improvements. And listening to the journey, moving from walking to running, I feel like there's probably another biggish, at least one more, possibly two biggish improvements, maybe not 10 minutes, but maybe 3 to 5, and then another 2 to 3 that'll come quite quickly. And thereafter, those improvements will be harder to come by. And it'll be a question of stringing together small improvements over a long period of time. But I kind of feel like you've got years of improvement in you when I listen to that. Setting the actual physical goal is so much harder. I mean, if I could have developed a test or even found one that someone else had developed that could really give a true indication of where someone's ultimate ability lies, I think I could have made a hell of a lot of money. But the reality is that we don't know where that ceiling is. We only start to realize we're there when the increments of improvement really start to slow down. And that can happen for many, many years to come. So, look, I would say in the short term, breaking half an hour as a target is not an unreasonable target. And in the longer term, I feel like there is potential there for 25 minutes, but that we actually won't have a better answer for. I reckon for the next 6 to 9 months, you'll get a more reasonable answer on that. But in the short term, I think you can get yourself down to under 30 minutes. When you get under 30 minutes, that's when we will start to add in a little bit more regular interval type of training. And that's why I almost feel like you've probably got 2 more big jumps in you. You've got this jump that just consistency and strength training will bring you another nice jump to around about 30, even under 30. And then I feel like that 25-minute will also come faster, because that's when we'll do the intervals, and the combination of those two things will bring two nice jumps. And then after that, you'll have structure right, you'll have good energy system utilization. And so from there, those improvements will come from really being consistent and training for where you are now. And I think that'll become the important thing as you progress on this journey, is set yourself goals, but always default to the training for where I am now, because that'll bring you the optimal improvements and keep the injury risk low. Like, the one thing that I can safely say is that nobody can tell you that they guarantee you that you won't get injured, because as you push the envelope, you are always have a risk of injury. But what are we trying to do? We're trying to really minimize that risk of injury, and we minimize that for training for where we are now, to look for optimal improvements in the short term, which can be bigger in the medium to long term, but they are based on making those adjustments and training literally on how we're performing right now.
Yeah, and Grant 51, you're still a spring chicken. There's lots of good running left in you, that is for sure. And if you want to learn how to optimize and really dial this in, I mean, Lindsay spoke about the structured training and the consistency. I mean, consistency is one of the pillars of our Fast to Be on 50 training framework. And if you haven't yet checked out our Fast to Be on 50 masterclass, you can click on the link right now. Go through, save your seat. We've got one coming up in just a few days' time. So make sure you save your seat, join us for that. And we look forward to helping you run faster beyond 50. Until next time, from myself, Brad Nadalt, and Lindsay Parry, it's cheers.